Talang ito ay rated SPG. Striktong patnubay at gabay ng magulang ang kailangan. Maaaring may masiselang tema, lengguwahe, karahasan, sexual, horror o droga na hindi angkop sa mga bata.
Previously on Film 10, klase ni Professor Ramon Bautista, si Mary Joy ay nagre-report.
Ay mula sa The Big Five, ang MGM, RKO, Warner Bros., Paramount, at 20th Century Fox.
Hindi inakala ng isang estudyante na si Michael Tan na sobrang ganda ng report ni Mary Joy. Hindi siya makaisip. At habang nagsasalita ang profesor, siya ay nagpapanik na.
Parang gano'n. Pag naiintindihan natin ang history, naiintindihan din natin ang mga nagta-travel tayo, naiintindihan natin yung mga tao, tumataas yung tolerance natin sa iba-ibang kaya tuloy-tuloy lang ang pag-aaral natin ng mga bagay na ganito. Okay? And that note, maraming salamat. Mary Joy, pasalamat natin si Mary Joy Yabu. Yan, Michael Tan, sa mga susunod na reporters. Pagandaan niyo na yung report nyo. Kita-kits tayo next week. Okay?
Oy, teka lang. Balik tayo sa 1950s.
From high in the hills, the city below looks like any other sprawling metropolis. Yet this one is different. Its fame has spread to the four corners of the earth. Its name is known to practically every man, woman, and child in the universe. For this is fabulous Hollywood. It's the exciting city of 1,000 exciting sights. With its grandiose Grauman's Chinese Theater, lavish resort hotels, pretentious movie palaces, colorful, exotic, playtime nightclubs of the stars, world-famous motion picture studios, beautiful, glamorous femininity. And located in the very heart of the fascinating cinema capital is this palatial home of the unique studio where glamour is actually created, not only for the stars of Hollywood, but for all women the world over.
Hello. Ayun. Magandang umaga. Ako nga pala si Michael Tan Sr. Kami ay magre-report ng Week 7, kasaysayan ng pelikula 50s to the present, paglakas ng Hollywood, pagbangon ng mundo at mga pelikula nila, tuloy-tuloy ng mga development sa sining teknolohiya at impluensya sa sangkatauhan. Magpapakita po ko ng video ng Golden Age of Hollywood para mas lalo natin maintindihan kung paano ba talaga nag-impluensya sa lahat-lahat ang Hollywood film and ang film itself.
This was the golden age of Hollywood. Okay. After the stock market crash in October of 1929, most parts of the American economy took a real hit. But not Hollywood. And at the height of the Great Depression in 1933, roughly a quarter of the American workforce couldn't find a job and millions of others were barely making ends meet. So you'd think that the last thing people would do with their hard-earned money was go to the movies. And yet, the Depression was one of the best things to happen to the American film business. Hollywood continued to lead the global film market for another 10 or 15 years, but that near-complete control over the industry was ending. We'll talk a lot more about this next time. Now, the golden age of Hollywood saw some major technical leaps in the film business too, including color. Filmmakers have been experimenting with color since the dawn of cinema. The earliest techniques involved hand-tinting individual frames, a painstaking process that had to be repeated for each print of each film. Not great. Over the next few decades, engineers found ways to use stencils to tint films much faster. They also developed other means of adding color, like bathing the film stock in dyes that fit the mood of the scene, called toning, red for violence, blue for sorrow, green for grassy. By the mid-1920s, nearly 90% of Hollywood films were either tinted, toned, or some combination of the two, which was great, except color itself looked wildly artificial. And once Hollywood converted to sound on film technology, the tinting interfered with the film stock's ability to record proper sound. Crash Course Film History, TLDR, it's hard. So filmmakers needed to figure out color cinematography, capturing color with the image. As early as 1861, a Scottish physicist named James Clerk Maxwell, who we talked about in Crash Course Physics, well, I didn't, Shinny did, built the foundations of color photography. The light all around us is made up of a spectrum of different wavelengths, some of which we see as visible colors. Knowing this, Maxwell figured out that all these colors can be derived from some combination of red, yellow, and blue. Beginning in 1906, artists and engineers tried for 15 years to use this technology to achieve color cinematography. But much like me in high school, they kept failing. Their experiments were unreliable or too expensive. Then along came Technicolor. In 1922, the Technicolor Corporation saw its first success with a special beam-splitting camera that could make two separate negatives. The light entered the camera and was split into different wavelengths, just like how sunlight hits a prism and splits into a rainbow. Half continued straight ahead, while the other half was diverted 90 degrees to produce two film negatives. These negatives were chemically treated, dyed either red or blue, and cemented together. Then you could run that final film strip through a regular projector, and voila! Even though they weren't spot on, the colors in these films were more reliable and accurate than any of the earlier attempts. And while that beam-splitting camera was expensive, at least theaters didn't have to buy new projectors to show color films. Over the next decade, Technicolor expanded its system into a three-color process, with a camera that recorded the original image into three separate negatives, red, blue, and green. And by 1932, this process created such high-quality, vibrant results that Technicolor ended up with a virtual monopoly on color film for the next 20 years. Throughout the 1930s, filmmakers and studios gradually began playing around with Technicolor. By the middle of the decade, producer David O. Selznick turned a corner by casting big stars in color films for the first time. And as the 1930s came to a close, Hollywood released a series of high-profile hits that proved color was here to stay. These films that used Technicolor ranged from the Errol Flynn swashbuckler The Adventures of Robin Hood to classics like The Wizard of Oz and Gone with the Wind, and even animated features like Disney's Snow White and Pinocchio. Advances in color cinematography would continue to develop over the years, but the basics stayed the same until film stock gave way to digital video in the 21st century. Now, a third technical element of cinema was standardized during the golden age of Hollywood. It's a little something called aspect ratio. That's the ratio of the movie screen's width to its height. Back in 1932, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, the folks who give out the Oscars, established a standard aspect ratio of 4:3, which looks like this. Also known as the Academy Aperture, this ratio isn't a square, but it's closer to a square than we're used to these days. That's because most movies we see today are shot in an aspect ratio of 16:9, which looks like this. That's more like it. We often call this widescreen, and so much film and TV is shot at this ratio that most new screens are built to fit it. But those are just two possible aspect ratios. Back in the 1950s, some filmmakers experimented with an extreme widescreen ratio called Cinerama. This process involved shooting a film with three separate synchronized cameras hooked together in an arc, and projecting it from three synchronized projectors. It's weird. The screen was shaped in a similar arc, kind of wrapping itself around the audience, you know, for a real immersive experience. And the final aspect ratio of Cinerama was about 8:3, which looks like this. The most famous film shot in Cinerama was the Western epic How the West Was Won. But, as you can probably guess, this process was too expensive and complicated to achieve widespread use. And it was bad for performers' necks. On the heels of Cinerama came Cinemascope. Rather than shooting with multiple cameras, Cinemascope utilized something called an anamorphic lens. This was a special lens for cameras that recorded a wider image but squeezed it laterally so that everything would fit onto standard 35mm film stock. When the film was projected, a similar lens attached to the projector would unsqueeze the image, expanding it back out and projecting it up onto the screen. The result was an impressive 2:55:1 aspect ratio. Audiences got their first taste of it in the 1953 biblical epic The Robe, and by the end of that year, every major Hollywood studio except Paramount was licensed to make Cinemascope films. Over time, the ratio was reduced to 2:35:1, and in the mid-1950s, the American film industry had almost entirely converted to shooting anamorphic widescreen films. It took some time for filmmakers to adjust to widescreen shooting. When you move from an aspect ratio of 4:3 to 16:9, that's a whole lot of extra room to fill. So what do you do with it? Well, we fill it with, knickknacks and stuff. Close-ups, especially of faces, became difficult to frame, while landscapes got easier. At first, widescreen films rewarded composition and long takes over editing. Filmmakers built their stories by filling the frame rather than cutting to new images. Genres like the Western, the musical, and large-scale epics all lent themselves to these kinds of world-building possibilities. In the end, the technical advancements of sound, color, and an aspect ratio that could surround the audience made the powerful Hollywood studios the center of the cinematic universe from the late 1920s to the late 1950s. It was a golden age whose echoes are felt in our films today.
Salamat sa pagpaliwanag ng Hollywood sa ibang bansa. Nag-nosebleed yata ako doon. Balik naman tayo sa ating bansa, 1960s. Itong era ay characterized sa isang rampart commercialism kasama sila James Bond at mga western knockoffs. At sa bandang 1960s, meron tayong tinatawag na bomba pictures or soft porn kung tawagin. Ito rin ang mga era ng mga musical films na ang producer ay sila Sampaguita Pictures. Ang mga studio na ginagamit came under siege sa lumalaking labor movement na ang resulta ay labor management conflicts. Ang unang studio na nasara ay ang Lebron. Sumunod ang Premiere Productions at LVN. Ang production studios ay pinalit ng mga bago at independent na producers kagaya ng Regal Films na itinayo ni Lily Monteverde noong 1962. Itong dekada ay nagpakita ng pagkakataas ng youth subculture na best represented ng Beatles and rock and roll. As a result, maraming movie genres na gawa na nagkikater sa trend na ito. Mga fan movies at teen love team-ups nagsilabasan, pinapakita sila Nora Honor at Vilma Santos. Action movies na may Pinoy cowboys at secret agents ay nagpapagalaw ng plot to depict a society ravaged by criminality and corruption. Sa pagtapos ng dekadang ito ay isang movie genre na nagpapakita ng ibang klaseng form of revolution. Ito ay tinatawag na Bomba Film. Grabe naman sila. Itong mga pelikula ay nagpapalarawan ng direktong hamon sa kombinasyon sa norms at kondukto ng lipunan. 1970s to 1980s, ang Second Golden Age. Pinakilala bilang Second Golden Age of Philippine cinema. Itong panahon ay lumabas ang mga avant-garde filmmakers. Sa pag-ikot ng 1970s, mga lokal na producers at filmmakers tumigil na sa paggawa ng pictures ng black and white. Sa 1972, ang Pilipinas ay inilagay sa martial law at ang films ay ginamit para sa propaganda. Si President Ferdinand Marcos at ang mga technocrats niya ay nagsipag para iayos ang mga filmmaking sa paggagawa ng Board of Censors for Motion Pictures. Bago ka makasimula ng filming, kailangan mo na ipasa ang script sa board at incorporate ang ideology ng New Society movement para magkaroon ng bagong disiplina, pagkamatuwid, at pagmamahal sa bansa. Mga annual na festivals ay muling nabuhay at ang bomba films at mga political na pelikula na kritikal sa Marcos administration ay pinagbawalan. Isang pelikula na pinagbawalan ay ang pangalang Maharlika ng 1971. Ang First Lady na si Imelda Marcos ang nagpabawal nito dahil ang aktres na si Dovie Beams na sinasabing kabit ni Ferdinand Marcos. Ang producer ng pelikulang ito ay si Luis Nepomuceno, anak ng Filipino filmmaker na si Jose Nepomuceno. Ang kumpanya ay nagkabangkorata dahil pinagbawalan ito nung screening, nalugi sila sa production cost. Naawa daw naman si Imelda at nag-alok ng pautang sa kumpanya gamit ang gobyerno, ngunit sinara ng bangko ang film company. Pinakita ng pelikula ang istorya ni Ferdinand Marcos sa Philippine military. Mga allegation na ang pelikula ay isang propaganda ginawa para ipakita na si Marcos ay isang war hero na lumaban sa Hapon noong World War II. Kahit pinagbawalan ang pelikula, ay ito ay pinayagan ulit mag-cinematic debut ng 1987 pagkatapos ng EDSA Revolution. Sa kabila ng pagkaroon ng censorship ang panahong ito ay nagbigay ng daan sa pag-angat ng bagong lahi ng mga direktor. Ang ilan sa mga kilalang pelikulang ginawa ng mga bagong crop ng mga filmmaker na ito ay sila Ishmael Bernal, Manila by Night, City After Dark, 1980, Lino Broca, Ora Pro Nobis, 1989, Peke Galiaga, Oro Platamata, 1982, Maria O'Hara, Tatlong Taong Walang Diyos, 1976. Noong 1977, si Eric De Guia, gamit ang kanyang pseudonym na Kidlat Tahimik, ay gumawa ng isang pelikula pinamagatang Mababangong Bangungot, also called Perfumed Nightmare. Nanalo ng International Critics Prize sa Berlin Film Festival noong taong ding iyon. Mula sa Short Film Festival na itinataguyod ng University of the Philippines Film Center at ng Experimental Cinema of the Philippines, ang mga batang filmmakers ay sumali sa Kidlat Tahimik sa pamamagitan ng paglayo sa kanilang mga sarili mula sa mga tradisyon ng mainstream cinema. Noong 1981, ayon sa ipinag-uutos ng Executive Order No. 640A, ang Film Academy of the Philippines ay pinagtibay na nagsisilbing payong sa organisasyon ng nangangasiwa sa kapakanan ng iba't ibang guild ng industriya ng pelikula at nagbibigay ng pagkilala sa artistikong at teknikal na kahusayan ng pagtataghal ng mga manggagawa at artista nito. Sa parehong taon, itinatag ang Viva Films at nagsimulang umangat bilang isang production company. Lastly, ang pinaka-political na filmmaker ng Pilipinas ay si Lino Broca, 1939 to 1991. Ang kanyang mga akda tulad ng Manila in the Clouds of Light, 1975 at Fight for Us, 1989 ay itinuring na pagbubukas at pagtatapos ng ginintuang panahon ng pelikula sa bansa. Ang mga gawa ni Broca ay nakatuon sa isang anti-Marcos, anti-authoritarian na uri ng politika at lubos na pinahahalagahan ang kalayaan ng masining na pagpapahayag.
Nag-ambag siya sa pagtayo ng isang post-Marcos Philippines at nakatulong sa pagpapakabagsak sa diktadurang Marcos sa pamagitan ng kanyang aktibong pakikilahok sa mga aktibidad sa kultura at panlipunan.
It goes beyond seeking justice, for this to I was asked in the beginning before. I think the Filipinos were too kind. There was just I think we were too lax on them. They should have been killed, as far as I'm concerned. My answer to that question about Imelda and Marcos before was always no tears for them. Absolutely no tears. I think they should have been killed, and as far as killing them is concerned, I would volunteer to be in the firing squad. I would want to be in the firing squad. And as a matter of fact, I don't know how to fire a gun, but for them, I think I will train,
1980s to 1990s, sa oras na pinatalsik ng People Power Revolution si Ferdinand Marcos mula sa pagkapangulo. Karamihan sa mga pelikulang Pilipino ay ginawa ng maramihan na may kalidad na isinakripisyo para sa komersyal na tagumpay. Ang mga storyline ay hindi maisip at muhulaan. Ang komedya ay slapstick.
Ano kanila? Wala kang kausap sir eh. Saan galing to?
At ang pag-arte ay alinman sa katamtaman o sobrang dramatiko. Gumamit ng mga producers sa mga formula na gumagana ng maayos sa nakaraan na tumutugon sa mga pamantayan at panlasa ng pangmasa. Ang mga romantikong drama, malawak ng pelikulang komedya at malalambot na pornograpikong mga larawan ang bumubuo sa karamihan ng genre na ginawa. Habang ang genre ng action ay naging laganap lalo na sa panahong ito. Noong 1992, napansin ng kritiko na si Justino Dormiendo na ang action flick mismo ay nananatiling pinaka-inabusong genre sa ating panahon. Ang industriya ng pelikula ay umunlad at gumawa ng higit sa 200 mga pelikula sa isang taon. Karamihan sa kanila ay mga pito-pito films na kinunan sa loob ng 7 hanggang 10 araw at naglalayang mabilis na mabawi ang kanilang kaunting gastos. Ang pagdalo sa mga sinihan ay tumaas at maraming mga produksyon ang naging malalaking tagumpay. Ipinakilala rin ang mga bagong batas na nagbigay ng higit na karapatan sa mga kababaihan na naging dahilan upang maglunsad ng mga karera ang ilang babaeng direktor. Noong 1993, isang istasyon ng telebisyon ang nakipagsapalaran sa paggawa ng pelikula. Ginawa ng Star Cinema ng ABS-CBN ang Ronquillo, Tubong Cavite, Laking Tondo sa pagkikipagtulungan sa Regal Films. Pagkalipas ng 5 taon, nagsimulang gumawa ng mga pelikula ang isa pang istasyon ng telebisyon. Ang pangalan nito ay ang GMA Network. Inilabas ng GMA Films ang critically acclaimed Sa Pusod ng Dagat, Jose Rizal at Muro Ami, which attained commercial success.
Ako ay nalulunod na sa kalalim-lalim ng Tagalog words. Hindi ko na kaya mag-Tagalog. Kaya last but not the least, ang 2000s. Para dito, gagamitin ko ang video ni Shubil Stock para ma-explain lalo ang state ng Philippine cinema in 2000s.
The Philippine cinema has been improving in quality for the past few years thanks to indie filmmakers and passionate AAA filmmakers who are willing to up the ante on what Philippine cinema can offer. Starting with the spark that lit the flame with Gerald Tarog's Henry Luna back in 2015 and the resurgence of indie films back in Metro Manila Film Festival 2016, with films such as Saving Sally, Seclusion, and more. Now, films of the modern day have been showing signs of substantial improvement via experimentation, innovation, choosing interesting topics, or taking these existing genres and giving them a twist to its premise that makes it unique. Could this be the dawn of another golden age for Filipino movies? There will be 2 movies that will be tackled in this video. The comedy film Banty Sisters and one of Cinemala's entry films Pandango sa Hukay or Dance to Death. Before we get into it, let us rewind a few years back, 2015 to be exact, to what I believe became a start for the renaissance of Philippine cinema. In September 9 of that year came Gerald Tarog's General Luna, a historic biopic that focuses on General Antonio Luna, a strict and tough general, said to be one of Emilio Aguinaldo's best. It depicts his leadership of the Philippine Revolutionary Army during the Philippine-American War. After that came the largest film festival in the country, the Metro Manila Film Festival, or MMFF for short. According to Philippines Travel Hub, this local festival is held to honor and celebrate all industry players in the local movie industry. This festival is so important that during the week when it is held, all cinema theaters are expected to put foreign movie works on hold and only show local content. In 2016, that's where it became apparent that the movies are now getting better, with creative and passionate people being the force behind these films, with the more prominent entries being Avid Leongoren? If there's like a video pronouncing this director's name, I'll just put it up there.
All right, we are joined by the director of Saving Sally, Avid Leongoren. Welcome, Avid.
Eric Mati's Seclusion and June Lana's Die Beautiful. I know, it's a familiar name. He directed the recent hit comedy film that we will analyze later. Now, with this lineup in place, these might be considered indie due to the fact that there are a slew of fresh faces for both cast and director. But in fact, some of them are supported by big studios. And according to PEP.ph, selection committee member Alfred Krep Yuson went as far as saying that MMFF 2016's lineup would contribute to a renaissance in Philippine cinema. What about the scene of Philippine cinema today? Well, in comparison to Filipino films before, it is a huge change with regards to the plot and style used. As we related to history, we could definitely see similarities to most films before. How in the 1970s, the story portrays issues of our fellow Filipinos at the time of World War II and martial law under President Ferdinand Marcos. As we observe now, Philippine cinema is much different than before. If before they focused on World War II and martial law, the Filipino films of today now focuses on social issues, most popular ones being LGBTQ and drug-related crimes in the country. It is amazing how films evolve over time. Movies Pampista ng Pelikulang Pilipino and Cinemalaya has released films that are worth watching. For example, the Banty Sisters, you would think that it's your typical gay movie or vice ganda type movie that only focuses on making people laugh and not making sense of the story. But that's not the case. The Banty Sisters is indeed a comedy film, but it also shows acceptance of oneself or an improvement on the relationship within a family, being forgiving and loving towards the people around you, yourself, and for what you already have.